This is Talk is Sheep, the official podcast of the Wild Sheep Society of BC, brought to you by Sitka Game. Come along as we bring conversations that matter to you into the high alpine.
Well, Greg, here we are, episode 120, and this was a bit of a different one. I got over to the HCTF headquarters to chat with Dan Buffett, the CEO of the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, and we got to sit down and talk about conservation. We got to talk a little bit about wild sheep. We got to talk about the great work that the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation does. It was, and it's always nice to do these things in person. As you've said, like the audio quality is light years above what we can do through the internet. So, and then just when you're there, you connect with the person, right? You can see their facial expressions and sort of their cues. It's so much better.
Yeah, and you got no risk of delay, and just the vibing off each other. Hands down, the in person's the way to go. I'm happy you're able to get up to HCTF and talk to Dan. That's cool. They've been one of our biggest supporters for as long as I've been a part of the society, and they're always wanted to work with us, and they support what we do and believe in us, and we appreciate everything they do for us as well.
Well, it's amazing what HCTF does, like for conservation in this province, and this really is the model of hunters giving back, right? And Dan and I do touch on that during the podcast, but I guess not giving back is the way, but we're paying our way for conservation, right? So the surcharges we get from our tag fees and the special permit that's sold down in Reno and a whole bunch of other funding pots all come together, go through HCTF to fund. To look after BC's wild sheep, wildlife. It's not exclusive to wild sheep. So, very, very cool program. I love it. I wish we did more of it. I wish there was more money there. I wish the surcharges were higher. Personally, I think that we should be paying our way even more. And please, no hate mail, guys. But just from a conservation perspective, the more that we can look after our wildlife, the better off we are. And I think HCTF does a darn good job of it. Personally.
Yeah, and they're giving funds right back to conservation. For those people that don't know, HCTF was one of our biggest funders, if not the biggest funding partner for our transmission film. They supported that project through and through, and they allowed us to spread the good word of what we're doing for disease in our province, and the battles we're going through, and they're standing there toe to toe with us. So it's great to have them on board.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, so we talk about our transmission film. We've talked about it before. We've had Jesse on before, the producer of it. We've talked lots about it. This past weekend, Jesse was one of the main speakers down at the Midwest Wild Sheep Foundation chapter fundraiser in Minnesota. He presented down there, showed the film. He said the reviews were fantastic, and he's been a busy guy. And again, he's doing this on his volunteer time. He's, of course, our director for the society, and he's traveling all over the province and just trying to share our message through transmission, make sure that the distribution was far and wide. And boy, we have done that. That was the one thing is you make this amazing film and it sits on a shelf, right? And there's nothing worse than that. That did not happen with transmission. The film was award-winning. We won awards all across the country and abroad. We won. I can't remember what award we won, but we did receive an award in Macedonia for the film. So really, really good outreach, really good distribution, and congratulations to Jesse. So what's our release date? When are we going live with this for the rest of the world to see?
Oh, Mr. Bone dropped an egg on us the other night. March 28th, that film will be live to the public, and man, I'm excited for it. I'm also excited to get rid of those questions we keep getting of when do we get to see it? Where do we get to see it? It's coming. It's coming, and we have a date. So, ladies and gentlemen, March 28th is the day.
Awesome. So you're going to want to tune in for that. Share it with your family and friends. If you're a conservationist, get this in front of your non-hunting friends, your non-consumptive friends that maybe aren't hunters. There isn't a hunting message in there. It's all about conservation, wild sheep, looking after our resource, and this sort of challenge we have with domestic versus wild sheep. And there's certainly nothing to do with controversy. We're certainly not picking on domestic producers at all. It's more of a collaborative message. I think it's a great one, and domestic producers have been very receptive about this too. You'll see the central character Jen Bowes in it. Jen's a huge advocate for what we do, and she's been a big part of our messaging and sharing this with the domestic producer crowd. And it's just a really good message.
Yeah, it's, the first time I saw it, it spoke volumes for what we are doing. If you have people that are on the fence about Wild Sheep Society BC or anything to do with the conservation space, like this film, it speaks volumes for us. It's a tough, if you care about wildlife, to watch that film and not shed a tear every now and then. It's one of those ones. I'm a big guy, and it definitely, the first time I watched that, brought a tear to my eye. I was like, it's powerful. It's a powerful message, and it was well done, and proud of what we accomplished. And Jesse and his team too, man, they hit it out of the park.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about Transmission 2. We're pretty excited about it. But anyway, you're going to hear more from us on about March 28th. Try and get a watch party together with some of your friends and family, and it's going to be awesome. So I think with that, Greg, we've talked enough about Transmission, but I think we can send our listeners off to episode 120 with Mr. Dan Buffett of the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation.
This episode is sponsored by our conservation partner, Frontiersman Gear. Thank you, Sitka Gear and Frontiersman Gear, for investing in healthy wildlife and sustainable ecosystems. Well, good afternoon, Dan. Just a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And we've been talking about this for a long time, about having you on. And, we've done quite a few podcasts now. We're like, oh, my goodness, we haven't had Dan on yet. And, one of our biggest partners in the conservation space. And, of course, the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation does such great work here in BC. So it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Oh, no, it's great, but I can understand too. I've looked at some of your past podcast participants, and they're pretty high-end sheep experts. So you won't necessarily get that from me today, but happy to be part of this because as you mentioned, it's that partnerships, right? In the wild sheep, whether it's the foundation or the society here in BC. I mean, you guys have done great work just leading and keeping the focus on wild sheep, whereas HCTF, we sort of have looking at lots of other areas, but that's why I always think partnerships like this are just great when we're talking about fish, wildlife, and habitat here in BC.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk a lot about those partnerships and collaboration. But I think before we kind of jump into it, maybe let's just, for some of our listeners that aren't quite as familiar with HCTF, let's just start off there, what HCTF is and what you guys do and why it's so important here.
Sure. So HCTF, so we're the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation. We're a nonprofit foundation here in BC, and really our focus is in improving the outcomes of fish, wildlife, and their habitats here in BC. So, our history goes back, just over 40 years where, the original funding came from the hunters, the trappers, anglers, guide outfitters, and at that time back in the 80s, a group got together and said, look, we're willing to pay a voluntary surcharge on top of our hunting licenses for activities that are beyond what government typically does, like inventory, and so this type of funding would go to things like habitat enhancements, creating better outcomes for wildlife and fish. And so at that time it was adopted, and so today, in today's world, if you go out and buy a hunting license at $25, you also pay a $7 surcharge, and so that surcharge comes to HCTF. So the government collects all the surcharge, and they come back and then they put it with the Habitat Conservation Trust. So that's just a trustee, and as a trustee, then the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, we manage that funds that come in from surcharge and some other sources, and get that out into the hands of people who actually are doing the work on the ground. So we've got twofold really functions. One is we bring that surcharge together with other sources of money, and then we repackage that into grants to anybody that's going to deliver good habitat on the ground for fish and wildlife here in BC.
Awesome. So with regards to that funding, do you guys have a mandate where the bulk of it has to be spent each year? Or do you guys sit on it? How does that work for getting it on the ground.
Well, no, and that's a really good point. There's no specific mandate that it has to be spent, but that's the ethics from our board is we receive a little over $5.5 million a year from this surcharge, and usually we're approving anywhere from $8, $10, $11 million a year in projects. So any money we bring in, is going out. There is funding that we manage that are endowments from the province to say manage conservation land. So there's an endowment we manage, and the interest on that can go out every year. There's some other funds that we've received from the federal or provincial government specifically for caribou. So they said, okay, here's $5 million and we want you to draw that down over the next 5 years. So we'll manage that. But when it comes to surcharge, that money in, the board budgets that. So, by every year when that money comes in, allocate it to all those best projects that come in, and out it goes into the ground.
So it's my understanding, you mentioned it earlier, that it's a board of directors. Kind of who comprises that? Who's sitting on that board typically? Like what representation? Not specifically individuals, but what type of people would represent? Yeah,
and that's part of the history of HCTF. Originally, those 40 years ago, it started in government, HCTF, and then in 2007, we came out of government and set up this board, as you mentioned. And so this board first has 6 sort of board members that are represented by the province, the BC Wildlife Federation, the BC Trappers, Guide Outfitters of BC, and so collectively those 6 members then choose the remaining 6, anywhere from 4 to 7 members, and those 4 to 7 members bring other expertise, whether it's academia or a particular expertise in fish, in wildlife, in governance. And so collectively then you've got 11, 12 members on our board that sort of bring all that knowledge of fish and wildlife issues, the importance of those issues, sort of bringing in that sort of regional expertise, and all that comes together to then be used to help identify what are the best proposals to be funded each year.
Okay, and I guess one of the arguments I've heard along the way is that some people are a little reticent to give government funding and trusting the government. They don't. Some people just, to be frank, don't trust the government with their money. But that's kind of one of the arguments for HCTF, that it's outside government. So, is that why it was set up this way? And is there? Do you find that's an effective approach to it, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that's again, originally when HCTF began 40 years ago, it was that really strong connection with the government. So government was able to manage or influence what funding went out. But as soon as we came out, that decision was made for HCTF to come out of government, in 2007, then that reduced or eliminated that influence or the hand of government to affect, the amount of surcharge or what projects could be funded as well too. So I always feel that's always effective, because you've got, surcharge, which creates that, a consistent flow of funding, due to the hunters, the trappers, guide outfitters, and anglers in BC, and then you can use that money to then match maybe money that the government has every couple of years. They might, provide a certain amount of funding, and then you've got, other organizations like Wild Sheep, like Forest Enhancement Society, that you can then leverage those other funding into great projects at the end of the day. So I always think that combination, of, like I say, you've got some government funding, but you still have that NGO side that sort of keeps the focus on the species, the habitats. You can bring in the government funding when it's there, but in lean times, still recognize that surcharge is the basis of HCTF, and it's just always there, and it's just that critical part of funding that just gives that opportunity to then leverage all these other opportunities that occur over time.
Really good. Now, one of the things that BC is sort of, I guess, lacking in my opinion, and I hear this all the time, is funding in general. So, we look at some jurisdictions like Idaho and Washington, for example, and we're pale in comparison to overall spending, let alone per capita and a whole bunch of other things. And we could argue that we have much more abundant wildlife than them as well, and certainly much bigger landmass. So, one thing I think is you guys should be getting a heck of a lot more money, and I also don't see the surcharges kind of, we see our taxes go up 6-7% per year, and inflation and everything, but the surcharge is kind of status. And I know you guys don't set the surcharge, but why are we not getting you guys more money, and how can we do that? Because our wildlife needs it.
Yep.
And to further complicate that question, the whole concept of our licenses, all those fees not going to conservation, is something that really is troubling for me, and I'd love to see that change. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about
Sure.
the funding model for us.
Well, you're right. And you look at sort of what we have. So, maybe HCTF is, say, on average, approving $10 or $12 million a year, and maybe some of the other funding programs, the BC Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program and others, they're adding another $10 million. So maybe we're looking at $30 million a year, 40, depending on, who you include there. But, it's a magnitude of what's needed really to change our habitat, influence sort of our land use out there. And so it's, it's not just, like I say, we just got the surcharge, and you could look at, the fishing side of it, right? Their model is, the fishing license side that goes to the Freshwater Society of BC. That surcharge on the fishing side comes to HCTF. But as you mentioned, on the hunting side, it's just the surcharge that comes to HCTF, and you've got that other part of the actual license side that moves to the government to fund sort of as they see fit. So I think you've got if you've got a model where you're funding some things, yes, but it's surely we're falling short big time, especially when you as you mentioned, compared to a lot of the other jurisdictions, whether you want to look at per acre of the size of the province, per person. It's just a lot more funding needs to actually make a shift, whether you want to call it being able to move the dial in conservation. I mean, there's a lot of good things going on. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of good projects going on in BC for a lot of species and habitats, but it's just not of the magnitude that we really need to reverse the trends that we see in populations, what we see on the habitat side as well too. And there's some aspects we can improve conservation better by doing some better planning, but at the end of the day, it really is about money. When I see there's a lot of good projects that just don't get funded or aren't able to be funded at the end of the day at the scale that we need to here in BC.
Well, and I'm sure you, at the pointy end of the stick here with HCTF, you get all these funding proposals, and can you give me an example of how much you see in funding requests and then how much you fund, just out of curiosity?
Sure. I mean, generally we fund about half the proposals that are submitted each year. So, say on average, maybe we're receiving 400 proposals a year. About only 200 of them are getting funded. Mm-hmm. Some of those that aren't getting funded, they're just not technically strong enough. Mm-hmm. And so we've got some funding programs that provide some additional support. That hey, if you need to improve parts of your funding proposal, there's some additional funding to get that. So we've got two components of those that don't get funded. One, just aren't technically strong, because when we look at them, we've got a couple levels of evaluation within HCTF within our process. And, we have technical teams that look at each proposal and look at the methods, the objectives, the timeline, cost effectiveness, just technically, can they even achieve what they want? And some proposals come in and just try to do too many things, and they won't be successful. So those don't get funded. But then those that are given the checkbox of, that's technically strong, that then moves on to our board. But there's always a number of proposals that just aren't funded because it's just the funding just isn't there. And so we're probably talking in probably another $1 million or so or $2 million a year of projects that are good, solid projects that we receive that just don't get funded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's pretty disappointing when you hear that there's all this work that needs to be done and there's just no resources there. So, with the government and the funding, and I don't want to get down a rabbit hole here, but it's interesting. Like there's, I think, $34 million in license sales a year or something like that in BC, around just shy of that 40 million mark, and then only a certain amount is going to conservation work. Is there any way we can change that narrative? Like we've talked with Together for Wildlife, they talked about, moving this away from, the government and kind of creating a separate entity to sort of attract outside investors, if you will, because government, again, there's maybe a lack of comfort with government sending them money. So, if we can bring this outside government, do a better job of that. So my biggest thing is how do we move forward and how do we find the funding that we need? And I hate to say it, but for me, it's embarrassing when I look at these other jurisdictions and people ask us about BC, and we talk about beautiful BC, but it doesn't seem like we're supporting it that way. And I know it's not an HCTF thing. You guys do more than anyone else, but our provincial government, I'd love to see them find a way. And we look at these other great programs in the States like Pittman Robertson's and a whole bunch of other ones like that. I think we could do better, and I think HCTF is a big part of that. I'd love to see you guys getting the funds because the work you do is phenomenal. Like your team and your support system and your board, nobody ever criticizes HCTF. I'm sure you get a few phone calls that why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that, but as a general rule. What changes could we make? What are some of the easy wins that we could do? And I'm sure if they were easy, we'd have done them already. But do you have any thoughts on that?
The easy wins are what things we can do. I mean, I think always, if our projects can, we get a lot of projects, and a lot of them are good, technically strong projects. Sometimes it would be benefit if if you've got a certain species or habitat area and there's some sort of plan in place that whether government's driven it or you've got Indigenous nations, you've got a coalition saying this is the priority in either this geographic area or here's the priority in these sites for rainbow trout. Because I think then when those things are in place, then that can help crystallize the magnitude of the challenge and focus on that. So then it's easier to pick out, these are the best rainbow trout projects or these are the best wild sheep projects, given the context of the land. So that's more about making more effective use of the existing resources. So I haven't answered the question, how do you get more resources to the table? But I think there's that part of conservation can be improved, and so we can get that funding closer and showing more progress, I think, in a certain area. And I think that then can help then attract better funding because hey, we've got some great partnerships in this area. This group is doing the enhancement. We've got some protection going on with the province. And I think that's, one of the other aspects too, is we can do a lot of great habitat enhancement work. But if we don't have those protection of that habitat for the work that gets done, there's nothing stopping 10, 15 years later, some land use change and neutralizing those habitat improvements that we've done as well. So I think those are, again, if you can, I think, demonstrate some more permanence of your investments to outside organizations, then you do have a better chance of bringing in some external funding. So I think it's sort of cleaning up, improving your own shop first, and maybe it's not first, but just cleaning part of your shop and how we deliver conservation. I think can be a little bit better here in BC. But I think also just having society on side of, hey, we wanna come together and support more conservation. I mean, you've always had the hunters and trappers, outfitters, they're paying every year, volunteering on lots of projects, putting money into hunting licenses. And I think, still the public at large still have that disconnect with the habitat, whether, they're in certain cities or they're not exposed to that. And that's, part of the, I think, other program we have at HCTF in terms of our education is connecting kids with nature, having those scholarships to support, students that go to universities. Yeah, don't forget about fish and wildlife. There's lots of other exciting things to do, in universities or programs, but, don't forget, about the fish and wildlife as well too. And I think that, connection is good. And so things like, the coalition, the Fish, Wildlife and Habitat Coalition that was initiated a few years ago in BC. I mean, I think that's, bringing so many organizations together, about, the common goal of, funding more for fish and wildlife and addressing some of the issues. I think, that type of, component we haven't really, in my, I guess, career, not seen that at that level and what they're kicking out and in terms of being able to influence and identifying issues. So I think those are things that I think more needs to be done there. So we start influencing the public. So whether you get into taxes or just recognition of the importance of that fish, wildlife, and habitat in BC. That's going to be needed as well too, just to set things up so when funding does come, or people are more willing to open their pocketbooks if it's private or corporately as well too, that there's just a more common direction between so many of the folks that are doing the work, whether it's us as HCTF getting money out to those that are doing all the work on the ground as well.
So, like I just mentioned a little bit earlier about the Pittman Robertson in the U.S., and that's one thing we've kind of sort of advocated a little bit for and talked a little bit through the society, and we're not just the only ones, but it would be nice because there are other backcountry users, non-consumptive, that are hikers and mountain bikers that are are quite they have an impact on the landscape, and maybe they don't physically harvest an animal and take it home and feed their family with it or whatever the case may be, but they're causing impact, and that's one thing. People aren't paying for that, skiers, golfers, certainly mountain biking, that sort of stuff, and not picking any one recreation stuff that I love to do anyway. But, how can we try and, and I'm not a big fan of taxes, don't get me wrong, but I also, how can we put back to the resource? So when we're causing a disturbance on the landscape and you're contributing to that, how can we give back to that? And I think we haven't done a very good job of that in BC, to be frank. I think that hunters care and they've been contributing. And I'm not saying people don't care, but I feel like a lot of other industries or maybe hobbies or user groups, for instance, they're maybe not putting in as much as they maybe need to.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, like I say, it's not on the non-consumptive side. Yeah, it's they're using the resource, and if there's a way for them to contribute to the resource in some sort of licensed, non-licensed way, like you say, whether it's that tax on the binoculars or access, or maybe it's even a voluntary license of some amount, as well too. Just something that then just demonstrates, and then again brings us all into more a common intent. We all care. We're all contributing. When we all have a stake, in what's going forward. And because so often you can just go out and walk and birdwatch. You sort of forget what it really takes and cost to whether it manage that habitat or protect that habitat from other forces that are coming along.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. One other thing I was going to touch base with you on is we do have this new strategy in British Columbia, the Together for Wildlife strategy. How's that affected what you guys do here at HCTF? Has there been a significant impact, or is it kind of just business as usual with Together for Wildlife?
Well, I guess in a couple ways I would say, one is, we have received some funding from Together for Wildlife, so they gave, provided a couple $1 million sort of over the last couple years for, fish wildlife projects that we've been able to bump up our grant output as well too. So that's been definitely a benefit. And we've seen obviously a few more projects that obviously have leveraged a lot of that Together for Wildlife funding from the government in projects. So maybe that's means a little less fundings requested from HCTF. So the project still gets done, but it's a little less funding from HCTF because Together for Wildlife is funding it. So I think those are, I guess, two ways that, I've seen the Together for Wildlife, affect HCTF both from an income perspective and probably a less demand, because then there's a few less projects needing funding from HCTF. So, but I think yeah, the demand is still there. So, I definitely would say I think there's good opportunity. When you've got HCTF funding and Together for Wildlife, I still think there's still a lot of collaboration that can be done, again, to help deliver projects that are more than just very site-specific, that are more looking at the landscape. It's like, hey, there's another funding source here. Let's get more money to those on the ground that are doing, that are delivering these good projects, but we can expand those good projects at more of a scale and make more of an impact, instead of just, again, having lots of small little projects that aren't as connected as what they should be. So again, I think there's still some more work that can be done in those parts with Together for Wildlife.
Right.
Yeah.
So you talked about collaboration there, and I know that I've been through the application process with HCTF as the society, and
the work we do, and a lot of what you do is who are your partners, who's bringing funding to the table. Talk about how important that is and why it's so important with, and you've touched on it a little bit, but let's go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think part of it, HCTF, we always like to see, partners in collaboration, and sometimes there's not a magic number, of, hey, this is leverage 2 or 3%. But what leverage does tell you is that means there's other people willing to contribute money. So that means there's strength that this project will maintain those benefits for a longer period of time. It means more people agree that this project, so it's not just say an NGO group, or it's not just the government. It's like, there's agreement between all the folks that have an interest on the landscape. So I think that's the value of what that leverage shows when it comes in the door to an HCTF proposal, and I think that's what the board looks at. Now, there are some projects where the justification is, look, nobody else is doing this on the landscape. We need HCTF funding, and it's a fairly high percentage of HCTF funding. And then that's when our board will be able to come in and our technical committees to say, yeah, we agree. This is a big gap. Nobody's funding this. And so in those instances, sure, the leverage isn't very high, but it's such an important project that gets approved. And so that's why there's not a magic sort of score, but I think the value when you're showing other partners are in, obviously it lightens the load, but it also demonstrates that there's really strong support for this project, and those benefits that project creating are more likely to stay long term on the ground, and that's a big part too. You don't want the benefits you've created in a project to be eroded by a decision that some other party has in that area.
Right. And am I incorrect in saying, Dan, that there's kind of different pots of money? Like there's a special sheep permit money, and there's these different funds, and that sometimes, the funding will come in and it maybe is designated for one fund, but it gets funded from another fund, right, all within HCTF. Does that happen as well? Oh
yeah, quite a bit. And that's, earlier on we talked about these different, funding pots. There's surcharge, the general surcharge funding, and as you alluded to, there's a wild sheep permit from the Premier's auction, fund as well too. So that has its own separate pot. There's funding from restricted sources. So we might get funding from the province that said this is specifically for caribou habitat restoration. Forest Enhancement Society say, yeah, we'll co-fund a number of projects, but it's got to be for wildlife in the forest areas. We also get court awards as well too. So the judge may say, hey, either this company was polluting, or this person was hunting without a proper permit, and that money will come to HCTF with specific restrictions. Might be a specific geographic area, might be a specific species, things like that. So when our projects are getting approved, we've got staff in the background saying, okay, well, what are all the restrictions? Let's move this money into this pot. This can fund for this pot. And then, so sometimes you've got a project with some sources of funding coming from different pots as well too. And that's what I see one of the roles of HCTF is we're doing this complicated sort of pulling money from different pots to fund these good projects at the end of the day. And then, as you alluded to as well too, there might be, in our wild sheep permit, there might be, say it's $300,000 a year comes to that, but we've got $500,000 of projects that were really high priority projects, so we'll fund the first 300, and now we've got $200,000 more of other projects of those remaining wild sheep projects, and now we bring it over to other potential funding pots and see where those wild sheep projects sit within the broader sort of wildlife projects, and then our board will then make those decisions there. So that's sort of, again, the expertise and sort of what our staff do was sort of in the background, just to ensure that we're getting the money to the best projects to get them out on the land. So then the experts can then, and those that are delivering projects can do that. So, but that's the accountant side of things, and there's some really good staff that have a really good mind for that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Now with your funding cycle, there you guys have an intake, you have a deadline, and then there's a review process, and then you make announcements, and then the money goes on the ground. Can you talk a little bit where we're sitting in that cycle right now and what's happening with everything?
Sure. So I think most, people that are listening probably are used to our our fish and wildlife projects. So these are our projects that are applied research, habitat enhancement. If you're sheep, looking at from a sheep perspective, those sheep health projects. All those proposals. We have our intake in typically October, November each year. And as you had mentioned too, the review process, board approval. So we're just at the stage now where our board, is meeting, and then we're sitting down and looking at the final projects that get approved and maximize the amount of that surcharge money that's been provided to us this year and getting that out. So we're about just a few weeks away from getting the announcements, which typically come out late March. And then early April, and then proponents know that, and then they can start planning for their project, coming up this year. For some other projects like our land acquisition program, it's open right now. That's going to close in another month or so as we get into April and May, and then our board at the June board meeting, they'll make the decision on those land acquisition projects then. So we've got sort of each throughout the year, we've got different projects, opening, but going back to it, our main bread and butter when it comes to surcharges is that November cycle, and then approval coming up over the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Now, Dan, in wildlife, there's wildlife emergencies. There's things that happen, right? Like there's die-offs or whatever the case may be. We got caribou that's kind of become an emergency, all of which we kind of seen coming, sadly, and couldn't do a lot to fix it until things got to a dire state. But, if we did have, say, an emergency, let's say, I know you guys deal heavily with fish as well, for example, a dam issue where, there's sludge in or something like that, or a stream gets cut off, or whatever the case may be. Is there emergency funding, and do you guys do that very often where you're like, okay, here's $2 million, go fix this, and let's save those animals?
Well, yeah, we have a process that we call an out of cycle process. So you can apply to that, and usually it's like you say, it's for those emergencies. So you've got to meet the criteria that, hey, is this an important population of species, and if we take no action over the next few months, is there dire consequences to that? So if it meets those two, then you can submit a proposal, and then the board will be up to them. It'll go through a technical review committee stage before it comes with our board, and then our board will look at the technical merits of it, and then look at what funding's available, right? So if depending where you are in that cycle throughout the year, the board may have at its discretion more money than others. Typically, it doesn't. To give you an idea, maybe there's one or two a year, so it's not often a lot where it's that real, emergency over the next couple months, but that process is there, and then depending on the magnitude of if it's sort of a site specific or a little bit bigger, then the board can make the decisions on funding available as well too. But we had a quarter war 1 year where it was a spill, and then that funding was provided, and it was really in the sort of $500,000 area, and it's like, well, you really need to get going on that habitat restoration there, because the habitat's really been hit pretty hard. So again, it's sort of that, working with people on the ground that, want to do the project, get the plans in place, get the proposals in place, and then try and get that money out. So sometimes it's, the emergency is there to, have to take, action within that first couple months, and then sometimes it's like, no, the whole process needs to be expedited there, so we can get going, in over 4 or 5 months there on the habitat side too. So it's the board will then sort of evaluate each process, the impact, and then make the decisions from there.
Okay. So on that note, you talked about, for an example, environmental disaster. How much do you guys see of that? So is it often where industry is sending money over for fines or penalties, or is it, I know obviously on the wildlife side, infractions and stuff like that, you guys get funding there. But how often does that come from industry, and is it a big chunk of your funding stream? It's not insignificant, but to give you an idea, usually we're probably under $500,000 a year. Okay. So it's not
we're not in the $1 million area, and then it's often really just it's driven by who's prosecuting. Is it a provincial level or is it federal level? So if the provincial level, then it'll depend on which act they're being charged on. But there has been funding, like as an example where there was a project. Or not a project, but in the Lower Mainland, where it was an oil, a pipeline was busted and a bunch of oil ran down into Burrard Inlet there. So that was almost about $500,000 there. There's been lots of other examples around, say, $100,000 mark. Those come in, maybe once every couple of years as well too, due to a pollution. So those do come in, but that sort of gives you an idea of sort of the amount and the frequency.
Okay, cool. I was going to hit on something else there, but I've kind of lost it. But I want to segue just for a little bit and talk a little bit about you. And
sure.
So you're relatively new to HCTF, but you're certainly not new to conservation. So maybe let's start off with where you grew up and how
Sure.
you got interested in the spot, because clearly this has kind of been your path for a long time. It wasn't just something you fell into late in life. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that, Dan.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll go back just growing up. I mean, I grew up just in the Lower Mainland there, just outside in Surrey, and sort of more hobby farm there. So I grew up. We had domestic sheep, just typical sort of hobby farm areas, and lots of friends that were involved in agriculture, friends that fished, hunted. So I sort of had that mix sort of growing up, high school, university, as I went through to do my biology, and that's when I started just thinking more about wildlife at that time, and just sort of thinking and just seeing the connection between land and species. And I always had that, I guess, more focus on the land, on whether it was when we were raising domestic sheep and just thinking about how grass grows and trying to create that production and that just nutritional value, and how the soil and all those processes come together. And then as I sort of got into university, just seeing on the wildlife management side of sort of plants and habitat, that sort of I was sort of got real interested in, and just seeing just those connections that you don't realize when you're young in life, and they just start coming together. And I thought, I thought I really want to become a wildlife vet. And I remember that. I remember driving, finishing university each year, and I used to take a drive down along the Fraser Canyon there, and I was always looking for the bighorn sheep up on the mountainsides, and it just sort of like it just seemed such an iconic a wildlife species. And so I tried to get into vet school for a couple of years. I just couldn't make the grade there, so I thought, well, what's next? And I started working at Ducks Unlimited just as a summer student there, and I was taking care of just vegetation management, typical sort of waterfowl counts. And again, that connection with habitat just really resonated with me. And we started just working in partnerships on different types of projects with fisheries and oceans, and you'd have different experts that would come in on, and amphibians and passerine birds, and just that connection of people working together. And I would always just see just better projects would come together on that collaboration. And so that was really instilled young in my life. And as I worked through DU, I worked through just a number of different stages of leading some waterfowl research areas, leading our conservation program along the BC coast, and just being part of negotiating private land acquisitions, designing wetland restoration projects, being out there with excavators and dump trucks building wetlands. And I just, that sort of connection to the land, and just seeing the seasonality of species coming through, not just waterfowl, but so many other species there. And I think that just continued on. So I ended up being at DU for about a little over 25 years, just leading their programs in BC and working with so many other partners. And I would do a lot of funding proposals to different organizations. HCTF was one of them. So I remember working with Brian Springanautic, who was the CEO here at the time, and just seeing that sort of strategic view of bringing partners together, looking at outcomes for fish and wildlife just really resonated with me. And there's a few other, just I think really forward-thinking folks, whether it was from the province or other NGOs, and that partnership, that collaboration just really resonated with me. So then sort of making that step, into HCTF after just seemed to be real natural as well at the end of the day. And I think, looking back, just having that connection with, hunters and anglers, and just seeing, even when I was delivering project with HCTF, or with Ducks Unlimited at that time, just the connection they had with the land, the volunteer hours that they'd be out, and it wouldn't matter, and you just sort of see, you can really appreciate now where a number of organizations came from, because as we talked about earlier on, it's just those people that are out on the land, they care about the resource, they want it here for years. And they just get really frustrated of why can't we change these trends? Because it seems fairly simple. There's some good projects, we need to make some different changes in how we make decisions on the land, and you could really reverse those trends. So I think all those pieces you don't realize as you're going through life, how they're connected, and then sort of later on in life, I'm like, oh, that's why that's the way those things end up being connected here. So I think that sort of, landed me, or like I said, it was a natural step here at HCTF.
Very cool. One thing I was going to ask you, I remember now, with HCTF, is there government funding? Do you guys apply for government grants?
Well, it's not. I guess in some ways we receive government funding for sure, and I think often it's more working with government to say, look, here's our program that we're trying to work with. Do you want to fund? Do you want to provide funding for this program? So. And then if it's a yes, there's some opportunity there. They said, yeah, that meets some of our mandate. Then we'll discuss sort of an agreement, and so they'll say, provides certain amount of funding for these purposes, and so we'll sign an agreement that way rather than putting in, say, a proposal here, fund us for this. It usually starts on sort of commonalities, like where do we have commonalities on for us, fish, wildlife, and habitat there, and is there funding? Is this sort of going to meet a mandate? And I think that's usually how these funding, I guess I'd call it partnerships or agreements, come together with the province.
So something like that, would it be something that you guys would lead, or would that be an NGO leading something like that? Or I know a lot of the funding you guys do, you get the proposal and yep. you fund it out. But is there stuff where you guys will lead and say, there's a prescribed burn? One of our stakeholder partners that I've been talking with, they're working on a massive prescribed burn project, like hundreds of millions
yes.
type thing. Is that something that you guys would get actively involved in, or you would just say, yeah, we'll support it, and then the NGO is doing the work on that? Or how does that process work? And
I think it sort of different. There's been different models. I mean, sometimes, in that type of circumstance, they said, they need an entity to sort of manage the money. The government might say, hey, we have funding, but we need an entity that's going to be transparent, accountable, provide the reports. And sometimes, and we can say, well, if that role is needed, hey, that can be our role, and then that money can go off to the other NGO. You mean in other times, over the history with HCTF, it's been okay. Well, that NGO, the province is willing to put in so much money, and then HCTF and other organizations say, yeah, we're willing to commit to this over a number of years too. So it can happen in different ways, and I think I'm always sensitive of trying to say, hey, is there a good role for HCTF to help support that project and bring the expertise that we have on managing different funding pots or grants together, and if there's a role there, then hey, yep, we can play that role in those circumstances.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. One thing I was going to ask you with regards to your leadership. So Brian Sprigonotic was the previous CEO, and then you came in. When we get a change of leadership like that, we've got a very well-established entity in HCTF. You guys have been doing this for 40 years. Do you bring your hand in and you change the sort of direction of the organization, or is it just soldier on? Like, how much with you coming in from the outside, I didn't see much,
Brian was great to work with.
Yep.
You're fantastic. You guys are very transparent, very easy to communicate with. But have you felt like you've changed the direction of the organization just a little bit, or just kind of soldiered on in the same direction?
It's a really good question. So it'll be interesting. So my perspective is, I mean, Brian's did a great job. Rod Silver for him and Brian Springanotic. And this time, I mean, Brian brought HCTF out of government. Like, he made some monumental changes here. A number of strategic plans, brought in some new funding. So I think, I was just really cognizant of all that. Is like, like you come into anything, like, don't mess that up, Dan. And be able to just see all those strengths of those things, and keep doing the good things that are happening. And then my role as I came in, it's like, okay, we have a new strategic plan. It was that last strategic plan was finishing, and so the next one was about to start. So that was sort of where I sort of had started working with the board and others and staff on developing that new strategic plan. And so that those sort of elements that came out in our strategic plan that came out last year, are things, there's always funding needs, finding more diversification of funding. We wanted to look at bringing new partners into HCTF. We wanted to look at ensuring that our projects are more resilient, whether that's making projects that are more resilient with climate change and thinking about that coming in. We've got, a couple key initiatives to look at. Being a better grantor, like looking at the barriers that we have, that applicants, will say, hey, this is a barrier to applying to HCTF, and trying to be more streamline our workflow and being a better grant administrator. And we've got a specific initiative as well as, how does HCTF work and engage more meaningfully with Indigenous people? It's hard because we're not delivering projects on the ground, but how do we also incorporate that in our process? And I think that's, I guess those are sort of the next steps I see with HCTF is, we've brought in some new funding with the province, continued on with some funding with Caribou habitat restoration. So we've brought in some new funding there, and sort of continue to improve and streamline the organization. So they're not substantial changes, but I think those are sort of the next steps, here at HCTF, and then trying to work closer with partners. So again, it's supporting those projects so that, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I think is sort of a key part of sort of our next part of what we do, and helping create capacity for being able to deliver projects, because now we're seeing that part, but just with people changing, people retiring, sort of the whole demographic shift too, is we're losing, there's some of that capacity to deliver projects at, a certain scale, on a regular basis, that being lost. So in, helping to ensure there's continued growth in the capacity to deliver projects on the ground as well too, I think is just sort of it's not the most significant thing that we have to do, but it's just one of those components that we see as sort of supporting also moving through conservation.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, great. One of the things that we talked about was collaboration, and when we talk about project delivery, you guys do everything from frogs to fish to deer to caribou to sheep. How does that prioritize? Like, is it like, oh, we got to spend X amount on this, on like ungulates and X? How do you kind of prioritize, and how much pushback do you get when you're, funding an owl project, for instance, for example, and hunters are saying, well, we're funding all this and we don't hunt, not saying that hunters, not everyone feels that way, but some people do. So just curious how you guys, and to be clear, I think you guys do a fantastic job of doing a very balanced job. I'm just curious how you guys manage all that.
Well, because I think, there's a couple things, like you say, respecting and looking and appreciating the historical funding from our search, right, for the hunters, trappers, anglers. So there's a number of species that they have, in mind. And so I know collectively our board looks at, things like wild sheep and sturgeon and moose, caribou, steelhead. Like, those are some really iconic species that often demand sort of attention in terms of funding. We also have under our own trustee and the Wildlife Act is we're supposed to look at fish habitat, wildlife habitat, and biodiversity. So we've sort of got that sort of aspect that's within our mandate, and so it is a bit of a balancing act, but often when we're looking at the bigger species like sheep and moose and others, they're moving through and utilizing a lot of different habitats, wetlands and forest and grasslands. And so if you're protecting those habitats, you're often protecting the habitats for some of these other species, for owls. Not to say there's still certain features with owls and bats and amphibians that's still needed in those. And I think when there's technically strong projects to support those, we definitely fund those. Mm-hmm. But I think when you look at some of these species that have wider range, bigger diversity habitats, by protecting those, keeping those common species common, although I guess you would say some of those common species aren't so common anymore, but keeping those common species common that you typically would regard here in BC, that meets the need of so many other species there. So I think naturally then by keeping that philosophy in mind, and as I mentioned some of the earlier, just focus on some of these key species, that's enough to sort of give you the flexibility to support a number of some of those projects that deal with individual species, like you say, like the owl and the amphibians and bats and stuff, and still keep focus on a lot of funding going to these broader species, because they are impacting quite the diversity of habitat as well too. And so we don't necessarily have buckets of X dollars for this, X dollars for owls, X dollars for amphibians. That would be a nightmare to do, but just by keeping this more, I think, broader approach, it allows us to sort of naturally sort of keep focusing on supporting those species that surcharge and our users are really focused on, and still meet our mandate of just biodiversity, as well too. So that's sort of like I said, it's a bit of a dance sometimes, because sure, when funding gets tight, and talking during COVID as well too, when funding dropped quite a bit, those conversations still would happen where the board does have to tell us within a fixed amount of money, what projects do we see is the best use of that dollar at the end of the day. But I think the board does a really good job of that balancing by just keeping some of those broad principles in mind when they're making their funding decisions.
Excellent. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of your flagship projects over the last few years, and kind of, we've had the great fortune of HCTF funding a number of our projects, and a number of very collaborative projects. We got a number of funding partners. Maybe talk about some of the big projects, and talk a little bit of the wild sheep stuff if you don't mind, Dan.
Oh, sure, yeah. And I think when you look at sheep, I think we're usually kicking out about $500,000 or so a year for wild sheep projects. And I sort of think of them as sort of three categories. You've got sort of the habitat ones there, where you're prescribed fire, keeping that forage habitat, sort of removing and moving in invasive species as well too. So you're just creating that good forage habitat, and there's lots of those going on. Whether you're talking, obviously we'd like to see more go on throughout BC on the prescribed fire side, but I think that's a really core amount of projects that we see each year. Whether you're talking the Peace, the Kootenays, those areas, then of course, the other categories, sort of the wildlife health side, the sheep health side. So, sheep separation projects, looking at disease and management, working with domestic wild sheep. I mean, I think that's another great category of area around the canyon area and spreading out in some other areas. And then finally, we've got, or I guess thirdly, we've got that category of projects where it's not inventory, because that's the government responsibility, it's inventory, but you're looking at population and connecting that with the condition of the habitat. So you're looking at impact of fire on those lands, or what's the value in terms of the condition of the habitat, grasslands, intersection with force. So you're trying to make better management decisions come out of that. And then finally, we've got a couple land acquisition projects. I know obviously while the society has been involved in a number of those, whether it's with Nature Trust of BC or Southern Interior Land Trust as well too, in those areas. And so I think those type of just really important projects that we see pretty consistently over the years, in those four categories are some key projects. And then when you move beyond wild sheep, a lot of projects to do with moose, similar thing, habitat management, health and condition, their population and their management as well too. Looking at the impact of silviculture and those practices on moose. Those are a number of big projects. We consistently fund a number of those in BC throughout the year. You could, on the fish side, white sturgeon, here in the Lower Mainland and up in the interior, are some other key projects looking at the impact of juvenile. These are really long-lived species, and so what's the impact of the juveniles and making sure that population continues to sustain over time. So you can continue on as just sort of bull trout, as well too, in a lot of different species and rainbows as well too when you get on that fish side. And so I think those are just really consistent projects of understanding sort of the population dynamics, the habitat needs, and then what's needed for their management over time as well too. Again, making sure those projects that we're that there's funding in place to ensure that those outcomes for those species are being not just managed well, but making good decisions and making sure that there's the information is there for the decision makers to improve those outcomes for those fish.
Okay.
So there's, it's pretty broad spectrum when whatever you want to look at in terms of a number of these species here in BC. But there's, like I said, you can get into small lakes and a number of different sort of habitats. We work there to, for dams. We support a lot of ensuring some of these dams that hold water back for the management of fish. That they're inspected. Sometimes they need to be improved. So there's some programs we have in place for them, for some aerators as well too, just to ensure that those conditions for fish in lakes too aren't detrimental as well. So those are just, I guess, we've got sort of the iconic ones I was talking about a bit earlier, and then just sort of regular sort of annual sort of work that just continues to go on that we fund as well too.
Okay. I think you said earlier, and I'm pretty sure I'm familiar with the policy that you guys don't typically fund inventory, right? That's the government's job.
Government.
So you're not somebody comes to you and they want to fly and count sheep in the
Right.
province. You're not going to fund that.
Well, exactly, and then I think that's trying to make that sort of stipulation. We're not here to fund inventory. That's the provincial governments. They need that for setting the regulations, things like that. Where there is times that we have funded counts is when there's a really strong connection with a management decision, like it's needed for a management plan and some management decision. And so then our board really looks closely at that, say, okay, guys, is this government responsibility? Yes or no. But those are times where we have funded those projects that have a really strong connection with an outcome that would improve for wildlife as well too. So our board is definitely sensitive to in making that decision as well too.
Okay. Throw a little controversy in here, but predator management is always a hot topic. Do you guys have a policy on that and funding, anything like that, or how does it work with that?
Yeah, for us, we've generally sort of, do we have a policy? We don't have a policy at that, but if you took, an example on the caribou side, we said, at the end of the day, caribou is just, they've lost habitat. That's the issue. That's the habitat issue. So, we feel our funding and any money that comes through us, it's like we'll work on restoring, enhancing, improving habitat, not for predator management. So that's the government, and others can fund those type of projects. But when looking not just at the symptom, but what's the real cause, and in this case, it's pretty clear that it's habitat, and one can argue this what sort of short-term emergency is needed in the short term, but from our board perspective, it's like, no, again, looking at that dollar, if that's going to be invested, where's the best place for that dollar, and are we going to see that return in 5, 10, 20 years as well too? And that's where we see, in that example or in that situation, habitat is the place in that area, not predator management. So that's and we sort of take each situation, I guess, sort of one by one, that the board will look at it and make that assessment there. But generally, you won't find that HCTF is funding those short-term stopgap solutions. It's really about what's the underlying cause, and that's where we're willing to put that's where we put our funding.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side of that, do you guys ever fund like a grizzly bear program or anything like that? Do you guys have projects like that get funding from HCTF for enhancing maybe a predator?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think when if you're always taking it back to habitat,
right? Okay.
That's a key part of that. We've funded some other, one of the other, I guess, funding areas that we fund is the people side, and the people part of conservation we've got called stewardship, where it's encouraging people to be part of the solution, and the other part of the people side is on the grizzly bear side, where sort of the coexistence of grizzly bears and people in those interfaces as well too. So we've supported some good science and some good demonstrations of what are better ways to coexist with bears on a demonstration, with the idea that we'll support that demonstration, getting it up and running, and then from there, when it becomes an actual program, that's where government and others need to fund as well too. So we may sort of in that short term fund those type of programs as well too. But yeah, I think in general, like I say, when you're looking at habitat, enhancement of predators, and what are ways to, again, going back to protecting that habitat, enhancing that habitat, you bet. I mean, that's within sort of the purview of HCTF funding.
Cool. And on the academia side, do you guys ever find, like, obviously you'll fund coloring projects and stuff like that, which you've done with us, but will you fund like a study, like a master's student that is maybe studying bighorn sheep or whatever the case may be? Is there funding projects for that as well? Oh yeah, I mean, I think often we do. There's a couple ways that comes to HCTF. Sometimes it's with an overall program, sort of an applied science program, where, like I say, you're doing the coloring and there's funding for a student to do that work in amongst funding to do the analysis and other work as part of that applied science. And then recently we've started providing scholarships for students in fish and wildlife here in BC. So it was in the name of Al Martin, who was a previous board member here at HCTF. So we have two scholarships we award every year for students in their master's and PhD. So that's just for them to do their schooling and project as well too. So then that's another way that students and can be funded for projects like, say, coloring and other things like that in academia. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I know I've taken a bunch of your day here, but before we wrap up, is there anything on the horizon for HCTF? Any changes coming up? Anything that we're going to be seeing from you guys that we need to be paying attention to, or?
Well, I don't think there's not significant. I mean, we're still driven a lot by our strategic plan I mentioned a little bit earlier, and in collaboration, as part, as a key part of that. And I think one of the things we're doing is just improving our grants and clarity. Looking at streamlining those grants. So there's no big sort of intense and big projects on the horizon, but I think those type of projects where we're showing collaboration, working more with Forest Enhancement Society or Wild Sheep Society, on silviculture, and trying to, I think, integrate those parts of wildlife habitat objectives in what we do, whether it's silviculture or anything else. I think those are opportunities, I think, in the future that I think would be a role that HCTF can look to play, with some other partners as well too, because I think, beyond just site-specific projects, as we can influence sort of the broader working with those, making decisions in the landscape, making sure those wildlife habitat objectives are included within the decision making. I think that creates, that's sort of the next step of, I think, conservation here in BC, where then you can really start seeing impact at a much broader scale than just at each site or within each small project. So I think those are opportunities that we all have to come together on, for conservation in my mind.
Well, I love your message about collaboration, working together. We need to get after it. We need to be all on the same page, pulling in the same direction. And so, I certainly love what you guys stand for, and you just do a fantastic job of supporting our fish and wildlife on the landscape. It's great.
Yeah, well, that's great, Kyle, because I think those are, like I say, those collaborations with the society and others, those parts are so important because they continue to provide the spotlight on those, whether it's iconic species, but those iconic species also represent really important habitats that BC is known for, that often don't exist in other areas as well too. So whether you're looking at it from the species side or the habitat side, that's that role. And I think HCTF, we can play a good role at what we do, and then that helps others be able to and continue on in the roles that they do, whether it's delivering stuff on the ground, shedding light and on these species and habitats as well too. That's all. I figure it's all, like I say, all pulling from the same team in a constant direction.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for taking the time to talk to us today, and just a pleasure to be a partner with HCTF, and look forward to a lot of great work in the future with you guys. Thank you.
Same thing on our part. I think that's the thing. The future always, in my mind, is always some great opportunities, and things like podcasts and and other things, just bringing us together, just to remind us, hey, we've got a lot more in common than not. So that appreciate you putting the spotlight on HCTF today. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.